Yeah. No, so in my book, right, Daniel, very similar to how you're thinking about it. I call it the tug of war between
Yeah, yeah,
states and corporations, right? So you saw that, as you rightly said, between the Crown and the East India Company, um, and then today you're seeing it between governments and big tech firms around the world.
yeah,
There's a tug of
yeah,
war,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And you can look at it in the US, it's happening with the whole antitrust sort of attempts and the attempt to regulate the big tech firms. You look at it in China, the Chinese context, the Chinese government has come down very strongly on some of the large tech firms there. You look at it in the UK, India, Australia, Russia, everywhere around the world, there's this tug of war going on between big tech firms and the governments, right? And one of the conclusions I make in that chapter, and I want to ask your view on it, is as I thought about, and now we are sort of veering away from empires in a way, but still related. Um, the question that many people today ask is, are big tech firms stronger than governments?
yeah, yeah,
Right? And I'm considering that question in this chapter. And as I'm looking at it and I'm trying to study it from a historical context, I'm looking at how this East India Company and the Crown battle plays out. I'm looking at big telecom in the US, big oil in the US, and now big tech firms in the US. I'm looking at similar examples from around the world. And I noticed one very simple thing, and that's the conclusion I draw in that particular chapter, is that the government or the state always wins in the end.
Oh, yeah. I don't know
So,
if
so,
that's going to be the future. I
so,
mean,
so I want to ask you this, right? So a lot of people keep questioning me on this, right? That, big tech firms, whether it's foreign big tech firms or Indian big tech firms, are somehow going to become more powerful and more influential than the state. Then this whole idea of Web3, cryptocurrency, etc., where people start to say, big tech firms are going to start to take up even the sovereign functions of
yeah,
states and governments as we know it today. And I only have one simple thing to say, that history suggests that there's a tug of war, that corporations often and successfully exert influence on governments through various both formal and informal means, as happened in the East India Company example also, right? There's many members of parliament who are shareholders in East India Company, and there's all sorts of entanglements. But eventually, when push comes to shove, governments or nation states have always emerged victorious. Thoughts? Your
yeah.
views on
I'm a little skeptical of that view. I mean, maybe this has to do with the fact that I'm in the United States, a place where our corporations are famously flourishing and our state is in a shambles, and those two things are not entirely unrelated. I mean, what we've seen is, I don't think it's obvious that the powers of the sovereign are going to be the dominant or the most relevant ones. I think that really turns out to be a historical question. And, my reading of various tea leaves now is, I mean, what I feel like I'm seeing in the United States is a hollowing out of the state itself. So it's not just that, all the tech bros are trying to sort of take over the currency function of the government. It's that, we used to send people to the moon with NASA. Now we're sending to them, now all the space programs are privatized. A lot of, I mean, the state is unable to capture a lot of profits in the forms of taxation because they're stashed in tax havens. All the kinds of, it turns out that a lot of the technologies of globalization are ones that make it really hard for states to control what's happening within their borders. So, I mean, we've seen a complete failure of the United States to deal with globalization in the form of climate change, globalization in the form of pandemic disease, and globalization in the form of this sort of plutocratic secession, whereby there's a lot of rich people who are coming out in the United States, but the state itself doesn't seem to benefit from that. It actually seems to suffer quite a lot as a result of that. So, I'm just not sure that the state always bats last. Like, I think that has happened in the past. Like, early and mid 20th century was a great time of state power, but I am not sure that the late 20th century in retrospect or the early 21st century will look like that.
Yeah, in a way it bats last, but its batting pitch is getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, the era of just the
pace that the private sector. So if you look at the East India Company, it's looking at trade,
yeah,
but as its main function to begin with. But once it becomes clear that to protect its trading rights, it will need military might in India to fight off the local kings and princes that are now fighting back. It needs military heft. That military heft then leads to wars, and then eventually you have this merging of the crown and the East India Company, right? So the question back to you is, now you're right, I agree with you that the private sector, the corporations are taking up more and more of the space that the states or governments have traditionally occupied, right? Space being a good example, security being another good example, right? If you look at the Russia-Ukraine crisis, you see a lot of the security.
These like private armies, yeah.
There are private armies, right?
It feels like it's the 18th century again. Yeah.
That's right. I've written a lot about it. Like, a lot of people say, oh, tech firms, oh, by the way, no, they don't have any armies. And no, actually now tech firms tend to have very influential and useful cyber, right? As we've seen in the Russia-Ukraine crisis also, many of the big tech firms come to the cyber defense of Ukraine, right? So when people say, oh, these big tech firms don't have armies, I say no, actually they do. In fact, they do have cyber security teams that are very strong, very useful and powerful, right? And so the question becomes, is it that the functions of the state are just going to get smaller and smaller, fewer and fewer, and that's the balance we'll get to between big tech firms and governments? Or the other sort of counter narrative is that these big tech firms are not democratic in nature.
Yeah.
They're not responsible. They're not accountable. Right? But democratically elected states or governments are. And so we don't necessarily want a situation where non-democratically elected big tech firms are now overseeing many of the state functions, sovereign functions, and we end up in seemingly democratic states where 90% or X number is actually the functions are not being done by the governments, right? And that leads to, and I talk about this in the book, a holy nexus, unholy nexus possibly, between big tech firms and governments, where suddenly they together can actually maintain this pretense of a democratically elected government, but the citizens and society really starts to suffer, both in terms of privacy rights, but also other democratic rights.
So the one thing I'd add to that, that fearful scenario, is that it's not just that there is a, realm of control that governments have, and then a realm of control that private actors have, and then the government control realm is dwindling and the private realm is enlarging. It's that, because the way you put it, you're like, well, we should be worried about this because states are, at least some states are democratically elected, and all states have a kind of responsibility to a public for their legitimacy, and the private corporations really just have much less of that. But I would also say that the more that states cede control and cannot control, various phenomena within their borders or sort of outside the borders, the harder it is for the states to maintain democratic or a pretense of democracy or responsibility, right? So that, kind of states operate for their legitimacy on a sense of, shared sacrifice. And, we all pay taxes because that's fair and that's the right thing to do. And then states collectively secure things for us. Like, we get that bargain. But, the more it looks like states can't do that or can't enforce that on the rich, the more we just find ourselves, like the rest of us are like, well, why am I doing it? Why am I paying taxes? And the more I think everyone is drawn into a really cynical politics. Which is, I think, exactly what we've seen. Right? The rise of sort of authoritarianism seems to have a lot to do with a kind of cynicism about politics, like failure to believe that the state could be anything but the cat's paw of, an out of control elite.
No, absolutely.